Every year on November the 9th, the church celebrates this feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica. And it's one of those feasts that's so important that even when it falls on a Sunday, we still celebrate it. As you know, most of the feasts that we have during the year and the memorials are overshadowed by Sunday. But not this one, which kind of raises the question, why? What's so important about this feast? And we can spend hours, and I know you're a bit worried, maybe he will. We can spend hours trying to answer that question. But I want to focus on just one reason why I think this feast is so important. Because celebrating a church building, the dedication of a church building, helps to bring us to a point where we have to deal with and are confronted by a fact that sometimes we struggle with if we are truly honest with ourselves when it comes to our life as Catholic Christians. And that fact is the fact of the church in all of her glory and in all, if you will, of her humanity. The fact that the church is a church of history and in history. And sometimes we struggle with that, if we're honest, because we experience disappointment. And so I'm going to reflect today on the meaning of this feast as an opportunity for us to confront something that I think we all deal with and I deal with, and if we haven't, we will. And in fact, that this feast might find a pathway forward for us. I remember when I was a student in Rome, I was so excited to go to Rome. It was the fall of 1997. It was going to be my first year of studying theology, and I think I had in my mind that Rome was like a Catholic Disneyland. And I thought, everything was just going to be absolutely amazing. And the expectations that I had were just off the charts. And as in that first month, things were pretty great. Second and third month, by October, I was struggling. And I couldn't even figure out why I was struggling. And one night where I lived, it was a college residence with priests and seminarians living there, the Norbertine order. It was up on a hill, the building was 4 stories, and it had a kind of rooftop terrace, which is fairly typical for Rome. And so I was up there on the terrace, and we had a great view of the city of Rome, and it was near sunset. And I could look out, kind of a panoramic view of the city, and I saw this brown layer just hovering above the city. I'm like, that's the air I breathe every day. Like the pollution. And as I wrestled with that, I realized, I was disappointed in Rome. It was a dirty, modern, secular city. And it was not what I wanted. And as I was there, I found myself wrestling with the reality of the church. Perhaps we want to have that place where everything is as it ought to be. Where everything is. And perhaps we have this idea that and at some point, that balloon is popped in a moment of disappointment, a moment of hurt. I remember, this is from my childhood, growing up in my parish, and I'm sure my pastor was having a bad day. I'd gone to the school for 8 years. I was with my friends playing basketball on the playground that I basically grew up on. And I remember my pastor coming out and threatening to call the police if we didn't leave the property because we weren't allowed to play basketball on the very property that I had grown up on. And I remember being just a bit disappointed. Why do I share these experiences? Because I'm inviting you to name those moments in your life where there's this tension. Let's begin with the beauty of the church, because that's part of the tension. The readings portray so beautifully. And as we look at these readings, our mural is literally a theological or artistic interpretation of the readings that we've heard. from the prophet Ezekiel, this temple where water flows out, where there's trees and fruit-bearing trees, and there's life. And we can see all of this water flowing from the temple. And we can see the life and the vines and the trees and the fruit-bearing trees and the butterflies and this abundant life. And we can see the saints who are kind of like, if you will, the new trees in the kingdom of heaven, the new heavenly Jerusalem, these fruit-bearing trees that come forth from the temple. And in the vision of the gospel today, we can see in our mural that the temple is the person of Jesus Christ. He is the temple in this heavenly Jerusalem. And He is the source of all grace and all light and all joy and all life. And that's the beauty of the church. Our mural portrays the heavenly Jerusalem. It portrays the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and it beautifully portrays the mystery of the church. It is as it ought to be. I'll be honest, I want to live in that mural. I don't know if you do, but I do. Am I the only one that wants everything to be as it ought to be? Am I the only one that wants a perfect parish? That wants perfect parishioners? I got news for you. I'm not a perfect pastor, okay? But I want perfect parishioners. You following me? That's what I want. And so as I reflect on this, I also realize there's this element that things are not as they ought to be. When I was a freshman in college, long story, I found myself taking a senior level theology class, all juniors and seniors in college, and this was our book, The Splendor of the Church by a priest named Henri de Lubac. It was like I was learning to read for the first time. I think I read this book 4 times that semester. It was a major work of 20th century theology, The Splendor of the Church. And there's a chapter in this book that probably saved my life as a Catholic Christian and has saved my life as a fallen, imperfect priest serving, I'm sorry to say, among fallen, imperfect people. The chapter is called The Two Aspects of the One Church. And he describes beautifully the beauty of the holiness of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the church that baptizes, the church that is holy, the church that sanctifies, the church that is everything we want the church to be. But he also describes the church that is baptized, the church that is being sanctified, the church that is human, the human dimension of the church composed of fallen, broken human members, including those who are in leadership. And he works through these two aspects of the one church. And I remember reading this book. I remember this book when I was in Rome. This was part of what got me through that initial disappointment. It's something that sustained me in all the different moments where I experienced disappointment somehow in the life of the church. And my brothers and sisters, what's on my mind to say is that the experience of disappointment, I think at some level, is unavoidable for us in the church. And if we don't know that, when it comes our way, it can be a crisis for us. It can be well, then why am I here? But if we can work through that, this mystery that God has chosen to work in and through imperfect people who are on the way, and to bring about grace, and if we can see the beauty of the saints and the fruits of that power of the grace mediated through imperfect instruments, we can begin to see the wonder and the splendor of the church. I also drew great inspiration from the author himself, Father Henri de Lubac. Because when he wrote this book as a theologian in the 1940s and 1950s, he had been effectively silenced by the church. He wasn't effectively permitted to teach or to publish. His writings were considered suspect. And so what does he do during that time that we can look back and say he was unjustly treated? Pope John Paul II would kind of correct that injustice by naming him a cardinal in his 80s. He wrote a book called The Splendor of the Church. It's a love letter. But this is not a church that somehow doesn't exist in history. This is a raw, church where there are fallen human beings, where there are politics and power and abuse of authority. And what does he do when he's the victim of all that? He wrote a book, a love letter, The Splendor of the Church. My brothers and sisters, this is where I think all of us at some level are, or we wouldn't be here today. But this is the vision we're invited to have. And so this church, dedicated on November the 9th, 324, this church that on land that had been donated by the Emperor Constantine St. John Lateran, this church that is the mother and head of all the churches, this church in Rome that is the Cathedral Church of Rome, this church that has experienced fires and earthquakes and barbarian invasions, this church where popes lived and resided for over 1,000 years, this church where all of the fallen and broken humanity was on full display at different times in history in different ways. This church you and I can still visit in Rome today. This is not a church of the ideal world. This is a church in history. This is a church composed of the living stones that are you and I. This is a church that in some way holds together the two things that we struggle with if we're honest, the two aspects of the one church. And yet I would argue that this is the beauty and the splendor and the glory of the church. And as we wrestle with that in our own journey, hopefully we get to a point that in the midst of those inevitable disappointments, hurts, and pains, we don't lose the precious jewel and gift of the church, but rather somehow we can see in it the power of God's grace at work in our midst. And so I conclude with an excerpt from a poem written by a monk who himself had experienced his own struggles in the life of the church, Carlo Caretta. He died in the year 1988. How much I must criticize you, my church, and yet how much I love you. How you have made me suffer, and yet how much I owe to you. I should like to see you destroyed, and yet I need your presence. You have given me scandal, and yet you alone have made me understand holiness. Never in the world have I seen anything more compromised, more false, and yet never have I touched anything more pure, more generous, more beautiful. I love you, church, so mud-splashed by history. I see in you the cross of humanity, yet I also see the glory of God. You are the bride of Christ, and yet you walk with sinners. You are weak, and yet you are the strongest reality on earth. You are humble, yet your mission reaches to the ends of the world.